Hello everyone, this is a collaboration with me and more SSTO. Kerbal Space Program, at least when considering stock parts and physics, has largely been a game of SSTOs, with new achievements popping up frequently over the recent years. Starting with conventional SSTOs that can carry cargo to low Kerbin orbit with immense efficiency, to ones that can complete a tour to even dual single-staged, and ones that can escape Earth's gravity well and come back from small interplanetary destinations in RSS. However, when attempting to go beyond that, we are limited by the lift-to-drag ratio of conventional wings, especially in the supersonic and hypersonic regime. While they are decent, we are approaching the limit of their performance. This was the case until a new building technique was developed, which involves the use of node occlusion and tilted ablative heat shields as wings to achieve a much higher lift-to-drag ratio. This tech, now commonly called magic wings, greatly pushed the envelope, and SSTOs off of Venus, Saturn, and several real-scale super-Earths became possible. Well, now you may ask, can we go bigger? What about Jupiter? With a size of about 11 times that of Earth, and a crushing gravity of 2.5 Gs, it dwarfs any other planets that had been SSTO'd. Despite its fast rotation, you still need over 30 km per second of surface speed to reach orbit, which is over 9 times that of Eve. Turns out, we need some additional tricks to tackle this monster. This orb of what looks like some randomly slapped together heat shields is the craft for this mission. Not only can it reach orbit from Jupiter's sea level, but it can also explore the entire Jovian system, landing and taking off from all the moons. And it's fully reusable too. Now, let's board the craft and take off with it. On the front and back of the craft, there are several sets of counter-rotating DLC ducted fans in a service bay, and we will use them to gain some altitude and vertical speed. Now that the speed has topped out for a while, we set the nose to prograde, and the lift generated by the magic wings starts to curve the trajectory into a gravity turn. As we reach our apoapsis, we are still not going fast enough to maintain level flight, so we get into a dive. Since the ducted fans no longer generate any net thrust, we close the bay and stop the propellers. As the craft keeps speeding up, it finally gains enough lift to pull out of a dive, and we use rollovers to stabilize the flight and dampen out most oscillations. This takeoff technique was used instead of the more common rise and drop method because of the much higher wing load compared to most magic wing craft, meaning that it requires a significantly higher speed to fly. By now, you might have guessed that this craft uses magic wings as propeller blades. This tech was developed by Stratz in 1975, and while it initially seemed to have some issues that would make it unsuitable for surpassing its predecessor, it was refined further to achieve truly astonishing results, therefore serving as the key building technique to make this mission possible. We will discuss these refinements later in the video. As of now, the very lengthy phase of gaining speed using propellers has begun, and we trim the deploy angle of the heat shields to maximize our thrust. It may seem odd that we are heading south at first, and only later turning onto a fully equatorial trajectory instead of heading due east from the launch site. The reason for this dogleg maneuver is that the extremely long flight time results in a large Coriolis force shifting the orbital plane by a large amount, thereby making the final orbital plane very hard to predict. This is also the reason why we launched from Kourou instead of Cape Canaveral. As the plane turns towards due east on the equator and continues to accelerate at a snail's pace, we would like to discuss some aspects of the mission. First of all, while we claim this craft is a Jupiter SSTO, it is incapable of finishing the whole journey in a single stage. It will only go single-staged from Jupiter's sea level to low Jupiter orbit. Beyond this part, there will be staging and docking events taking place. However, this is still a fully reusable mission, and everything launched will also be recovered. Second, while the physics in this mission is entirely stock, this is not completely true for parts. In order for our computers to be able to run the mission, some fuel tanks, RTGs, and engines were merged together into a single part, with their mass ratio, power per mass, ISP, and DWR kept the same as their stock counterparts. Though this process didn't change the aero characteristics of the craft, it did affect the thermal and structural behavior of the craft to some extent. What we did was try to minimize these changes by being careful when building the craft. These merged parts are really important when ascents can last for days. Besides that, there are no other non-stock parts. We also used some quality of life mods, such as time warp and autopilot assists, that are really helpful for the mission. Third, some things are outdated, both the version of KSP and the building technique in this mission. This mission was done in 1.8.1, particularly due to issues with smoothly running KSP 1.10 and above, and also to gain a small advantage in part mass, as the engine plates in 1.8 are much lighter than in later versions. Also, there is now a new building technique, which is much better than heat shield magic wings and could potentially allow for a completely single-stage mission. However, this tech only works in KSP 1.10 and 1.11, and wasn't known at all when the craft was first designed. And, finally, some of the save files were edited due to a very frequent Kraken-related bug that wasn't evident during the test phase. We made sure that anything outside of the scope of this bug would be left the same, and we'll elaborate on this issue when the Kraken reveals itself. I will just shut up for now and let you enjoy the rest of the flight. As the craft reaches a thinner and thinner atmosphere, the RPM of the props goes up, and the attitude becomes more unstable. So by this point, we need to throttle back a bit, otherwise the craft would lose control and disintegrate. After going around Earth several times, we reached a speed of 6,200 meters per second. By this point, the acceleration we are getting out of the props is really small, so we light up the 12 ion engines and finish the ascent to orbit. After reaching a suborbital trajectory, we shut down the ion engines and coast toward apoapsis, where we do a brief circularization burn. After 36 hours of flight, we have finally reached orbit. As mentioned before, this craft has multiple stages to complete the journey. The first stage we are going to shed is the launch assist module, consisting of most of the ducted fans and some fuel tanks. You may wonder how the craft even gets rid of the stages if pretty much everything is clipped into the small fairing. The solution for this is mounting the modules onto hinges and then swinging the modules out of the fairing. This was a bit of a hassle, since the large mass of the modules relative to the hinges made locking the hinges really hard. Finally, after the module is clear from the rest of the craft, we stage it off and leave it in low Earth orbit. After staging, it's time to transfer to the moon. As with most ion-powered craft, it took dozens of periapsis kicks to reach a lunar encounter. Well, this will take a while. After all the burns, we start a lengthy chain of gravity assists. First, our good old friend the moon will eject us onto a higher orbit around the Earth, and then eject us from the Earth-Moon system. Then, it's a matter of chaining together more Earth-Moon assists, with some Earth-only phasing or timing assists between those. After several lunar assists, we gained enough relative velocity to reach Venus, and the Venus assist further increases our velocity relative to Earth. And finally, 3 more Earth assists will throw us onto an encounter with our destination, Jupiter. Now that we have entered Jupiter's SOI, it is time to put all the modules back into the fairing to make sure they don't burn up. As with before, this was a little tedious. We are hitting the atmosphere at nearly 50 km per second, so it will soon get very toasty. Luckily for us, the magic wings at the front are more than enough to keep us safe. We kept a pair of ducted fans at the back of the craft, so we just need to open the service bay to generate a lot of drag. Now that we have arrived at the Jovian system, we should split the craft up. After some unfolding and fuel transfer, we detach a small craft that is going to land on the moons. The rest of the craft, which contains the Jupiter SSTO, will be left in this highly elliptical orbit. We are still in an orbit that doesn't intersect any of the moons. We will use a burn at our apoapsis to raise our periapsis and change our inclination so that we can intercept Io. And, of course, we didn't forget to put the main craft onto a stable orbit. Now, we are facing an even longer gravity assist chain. We first start with repeated assists off of Io to lower our orbit, and to cancel out our remaining relative inclination. There are some characteristics of the Jovian system that make gravity assists within it really tedious. The main one being that the escape velocity of the moons is very small compared to their orbital speed around Jupiter, which results in a rather small deflection angle for most of the assists, as is the case with Io, where we are passing at a speed of about 9 km per second and our encounter trajectory is basically a straight line. Another issue is the relatively large size of the moons relative to their orbit, which means that corrections and especially plane changes must be planned early on, otherwise the required delta V would become very significant. After the Io assists, we use several Callisto assists to raise our periapsis to intercept Europa. And after several intercepts with Europa, we lowered our orbit to match that of Ganymede. However, our relative velocity is still a bit too high, so we do several assists off of Ganymede, and we do one more assist off of Europa before coming back to Ganymede. However, we won't capture just yet. Instead, we will use some more Ganymede assists such that we ultimately encounter it on an equatorial trajectory. This will make our landing and takeoff significantly easier. It is now finally time to capture at Ganymede. After capturing, we will leave our fuel reserve and most of the batteries in elliptical orbit to decrease the amount of mass hauled in and out of Ganymede's gravity well. After some retro burns, we are in an equatorial low Ganymede orbit. Before the landing, we detach a small transfer stage consisting of a return fuel tank, an RTG, and some batteries. Here, we chose to land on the highest spot below the equator, meaning that we only need to focus on the starting time of a burn, which makes targeting significantly easier. As for the lander itself, it is rather unusual to see ion engines powered by a fuel cell. While a purely chemical lander, powered by an ant and a spider engine, is a lot lighter than this lander, the much higher effective ISP of the ion fuel cell combo at 1292 seconds significantly reduced our total propellant requirements. On the other hand, powering the ions by a large battery bank, RTGs, or even by solar panels isn't viable, as that would simply be too heavy. It should be pointed out there, though, that, for a sufficiently large craft, a nerve-powered lander would be the best one to use. After this descent with a fairly low TWR, we have finally touched down. Time for Bill to stretch his legs after sitting for so long in a tiny little airlock, and plant a flag. After a bit of leg stretching, it's time to board the craft and take off. For the takeoff, the transversely mounted fuel cell angles the craft into an almost perfect pitch, meaning that we can get into an almost horizontal takeoff without using the reaction wheel. From there, getting to orbit is rather straightforward, and since we parked the transfer stage in an equatorial orbit, all we need to do is launch due east and keep an eye on the latitude and inclination. Time to rendezvous. With some fine-tuned maneuvers, we end up very close to the transfer stage. Now we just need to turn, arrest our velocity, move towards the docking port, and dock. It looks like something is really wrong. For some reason, docking ports will get attracted to or even dock to ports they are not supposed to dock to at all. This is the kraken we were mentioning earlier. As a result, docking ports that are supposed to attract each other no longer do so, and sometimes other severe consequences pop up, such as a corrupted part tree, internal stress buildup, and force leaks caused by the kraken. And, most annoyingly, this kraken occurred a lot of times during the mission. It seems as if the only fix for this is editing the save file to change the state of the docking port. After fixing the issue, we have finally docked to the transfer stage. Now, it's time to raise our orbit to rendezvous with a fuel depot we left in elliptical orbit. After exhausting the liquid fuel oxidizer mix during the first burn, it is now up to the RTG in the transfer stage to recharge the batteries. And with a few more maneuvers, we rendezvous and dock. Now it's time to transfer to our next target, Callisto. Instead of heading straight to Callisto, we will do a few Ganymede flybys first, since the equatorial plane is far away from the orbital plane of the moons. Now, we are arriving at Callisto, this time on a trajectory very close to being equatorial, so we can capture right away, and fix our inclination by doing a small burn at our apoapsis. After this, it's time to decouple the fuel depot again, and then we break into a low Callisto orbit. Just as before, we get rid of the transfer stage. Another successful landing. Time to get out and walk around. Bill tries to push the craft to the hilltop, but it looks like it's a bit too heavy for him to move it. So time to plant a flag and stretch our legs before boarding the craft and starting the ascent. Ascent isn't much different from that on Ganymede, but as with the landing, significantly less pitch is needed to maintain altitude due to the lower gravity. After getting into orbit, we go for a rendezvous with the transfer stage, which took a bit of effort this time, but in the end, we docked to it successfully. After this, we still have to transfer to a higher orbit to rendezvous and dock with a fuel depot. With the stages docked, we will transfer to our next destination. First, a single assist off of Callisto sends us onto a rendezvous with Ganymede, and then a few assists off of Ganymede throw us towards a rendezvous with Europa. And a few Europa assists later, we fly by our destination, Io, and we capture into an equatorial orbit. The order of the landings, that being Ganymede, Callisto, Io, and Europa, may seem convoluted. The main reason for this path is that it uses more resources early on in the mission to reduce the fuel needed for the transfers. In terms of resources used to get from a highly elliptical orbit to a landing and then back to a highly elliptical orbit, Ganymede takes the most resources, with Callisto and Io being almost tied for second place. Io needing more mass for takeoff and landing, and Ganymede more for transfer. And finally, Europa takes the least resources. Just as before, we leave the fuel depot in an elliptical orbit and break into a low orbit. After staging off a transfer stage, we start the landing as usual. As before, with the loss of centripetal acceleration, we will need to start to pitch up. Since Io has a much higher gravity than the other Jovian moons, in fact the highest of all the moons in RSS, we need to angle up significantly higher than on the other moons. The landing was a bit miscalculated, but luckily we come to a stop after a brief bounce on the terrain. Seems like the airlock is much more crash resistant than what is set on the tooltip. Now, Bill can get out and have a bite of this giant radiation-cooked cheesy pizza, all while admiring the full beauty of the Jovian aurora. As calm as Bill is, the craft just decides to slide and jitter around. Maybe the Kraken also loves Io's cheesy surface. After planting the flag and having snacked enough from Io, it's time to take off. The tilt angle given by the fuel cell is just barely enough for this craft to leave the surface. The ascent isn't too different from the previous two destinations. After reaching orbit, we proceed with the docking as usual. As with before, a few periapsis kicks send us into a rendezvous with a fuel depot, and we manage to dock. Now, it is time to transfer to the last moon of Jupiter, Europa. After the ejection, we perform a few assists off of Io to align our orbital plane, followed by several assists off of Europa. Instead of capturing, we use a small assist off of Ganymede to reduce our relative velocity to Europa. After coming back, we perform another flyby of Europa, and the next time we come back after that, we execute a part of our capture burn. This burn was calculated such that when we come back the next time, we encounter Europa on a nearly equatorial trajectory. Because the first burn was done at a fairly low periapsis, it doesn't incur extra delta V compared to simply capturing. After capturing, we again stage off a fuel depot, but since this is the last of our moon landings, we will carefully put down the stage with no roll or yaw, so that when we come back, we can easily fine-tune the relative roll of the docking instead of eyeballing it. We lower our orbit the same way as before. After reaching low orbit, we stage off a transfer stage, and as before, we keep an eye on its roll and yaw. Landing is fairly straightforward, even though the landing area is much smaller than on the other bodies. Bill now gets out of a hatch to stretch his legs and maybe stock up on snacks by doing some ice fishing. He won't have any chance to leave the hatch again before returning to Earth. After catching up with the craft that started to slide downhill, it's time to board and take off. Even though Bill has finished all the landings on the solid bodies, with this being a Jupiter 5 instead of a Jupiter 4 mission, the toughest and longest part of the mission is yet to come. With a carefully tuned approach and a bit of luck, we ended up in a nearly perfect rendezvous. After slowing down, all that has to be done is to point the craft in the correct orientation and let it drift towards the docking port by itself. After the docking, we raise our orbit and rendezvous with the fuel depot. Just as we won before, this rendezvous is nearly perfect, and we just slide into the docking port after slowing down with a few minor adjustments. With the docking finished, we go on another large chain of gravity assists. We have to work our way to the main craft parked in high Jupiter orbit, starting from an orbit around Europa, and we need to carefully align our periapsis with the target so that we don't need to do any substantial corrections. A few assists off of Europa throw us onto a transfer to Ganymede, and a few flybys off of Ganymede fling us towards Callisto. However, we still need to increase our relative velocity to Callisto, so this assist puts us onto a rendezvous with Ganymede. We then come back to Callisto, and the first assist sends us to another intercept with Callisto, again at a carefully chosen position. After that, a series of assists with Callisto will lower our orbit until we intercept Io with the correct position and relative velocity. Once that is done, a series of assists off of Io will be used to boost up the apoapsis and also to change inclination a bit to match apsides with the target orbit. Due to the high relative velocity to Io, this took quite a few flybys. After finishing the assists, we perform a burn at the apoapsis to simultaneously lower our periapsis to match that of the target, and also to match our orbital plane with it. During the assists, we intentionally set our apoapsis to be lower than the apoapsis of the target's orbit, so that we don't need to wait that long around Jupiter. After some adjustments, we achieve a rendezvous with the target. Since we used gravity assists, it took us less than 700 meters per second of delta V to get there from Europa. After the docking, we transfer some fuel. We have one Oscar B tank worth of liquid fuel and oxidizer in the stage that we used to get to Jupiter. This fuel will now be transferred to the small lander to be used later. Now it's time to shuffle around some modules and undock everything, starting with the stage that contains the spent tanks used to get to Jupiter along with some fuel for the return. Then we will undock the small lander and its own transfer stage from the rest of the stack, and then dock this craft to the main craft. The remaining two stages will now be left in high Jupiter orbit. With the stages reshuffled, it is now time to fold up the craft again and get it ready for atmospheric flight. We now lower our periapsis into the atmosphere and come down for some aerobraking passes. During the aerobraking, we alternate between rolling up, sideways, and down to keep the craft inside the atmosphere for longer, and to keep it from disintegrating due to excessive g-forces, as well as to change the inclination into an equatorial orbit. You may notice that there is an overheating bar that sometimes spikes up and disappears rapidly. For some reason, one of the ducted fan blades cannot be shielded firmly in a consistent manner. If we do nothing, it will overheat very quickly and explode. Luckily for us, temporarily closing the cargo bay and then reopening it, or just slightly adjusting our roll, can occlude it for a while and allow it to cool down. In theory, we could just aerobrake down into a low equatorial orbit with one pass, but doing so would increase the risk of a single failure ruining the aerobraking, so we split it up into a few passes and save once outside of the atmosphere. After a lengthy process of aerobraking and shedding nearly 20 km per second, we arrived into a low equatorial suborbital trajectory. After reaching the thinner parts of the atmosphere where the craft experiences practically no stress, we start the unfolding process again. Since the aero model hasn't been updated yet, all the parts that are folded out are still considered occluded by the fairing and don't incur any additional drag. Due to the same docking port kraken issues we saw earlier, we experienced some difficulty unfolding the craft, but, with some swinging, we managed to overcome the attraction between the ports and straighten the craft. After leaving the atmosphere, we undock the Jupiter SSTO from the rest of the craft, and we use the engines on the moon lander to circularize the transfer stage onto a stable orbit. Since this is the single longest burn that needs to be carried out without enough RTGs to power the ion engines, we will use the fuel cell in the lander running on the liquid fuel and oxidizer transferred there previously as the main source of electricity. For any future burns, we will use the batteries charged up by the single RTG. After parking the transfer stage complex onto a stable orbit, we switch over to Bill with his Jupiter SSTO. The first part of the re-entry isn't very different from aerobraking, and we just shift between facing up or down to control the g-forces. Once speed drops below half the orbital surface speed, we point back up and let the craft fly itself, as now simply by descending we can generate enough drag to slow us down quickly. After the long re-entry phase, when the speed drops below 1500 meters per second, the nose of the craft drops quickly, and we start an even longer descent down to sea level, during which our speed will continuously drop as the atmosphere gets thicker. This phase lasted so long that it's already night when we arrive at the lower part of the atmosphere. Once we reach an altitude of 1 kilometer above sea level, we close the cargo bay. This sudden decrease in drag caused quite a disturbance to the flight, but luckily the strong reaction wheels managed to keep the craft under control, and a few rollovers stabilized the descent. From now on, the minuscule drag from the heat shields and the fairing would allow us to keep descending, albeit in a very shallow manner. Since we used real solar system visual enhancements, the glitchy collider of Jupiter's surface was removed, making Jupiter's surface behave in the same manner as stock Joule. Since it lacks a solid surface, we dip below 0 meters and start up the props at low power to slow down the descent. Finally, we skim past negative 245 meters, just 5 meters above certain depth, at which point we increase the prop RPM and start ascending. Initially, the combination of 1000 atmospheres of pressure and the low speed meant that the props behaved oddly, so we played with the torque, throttle, and deploy angle carefully to avoid the oscillations building up to the point of losing control and disintegrating. As such, our initial ascent is very slow. However, as the air thins out a bit, we set the props to full torque and adjust the deploy angles for better thrust. After climbing up for more than 500 kilometers with a fairly low vertical speed, the craft now slowly levels out and starts to accelerate. This propeller acceleration phase will be extremely long, so during this time, we would like to talk about some of the key engineering features of this craft. First, while magic props are indeed very fast, they aren't fast enough to reach orbit on Jupiter, and therefore, along with magic props, this craft also packs a decent amount of xenon, with xenon tanks comprising more than half of the craft's mass. Second, this craft uses the 1.875 meter DLC heat shields as main wings and as propeller blades, which have both the highest lift-to-drag and lift-to-mass ratios of all the heat shields. However, using these particular heat shields instead of the 1.25 meter ones as prop blades presents a challenge. On Jupiter, the high gravity is the biggest enemy. This is the reason why, while its delta-v to orbit isn't extraordinarily high, one still can't use fixed magic wings and ion engines to get into orbit, as the ducted fans simply can't push the craft fast and high enough for the ion engines to overcome drag without a massive investment in dry mass. This high-gravity environment is still challenging, even for magic props. It requires the wings to produce more lift, and, since the blades are of the same type as the main wings, they will produce the same lift if deployed at an angle of 45 degrees. Turns out, if we run the props with just one motor per propeller, we would either need to greatly reduce the deploy angle, or reduce the prop radius, or add a lot more wings to reduce the amount of lift generated by each wing. The first two options would reduce the ratio between thrust and drag produced by the props, basically undoing the advantages of using the DLC heat shields rather than the smaller ones, while the last option increases our ratio of mass devoted to the aerodynamics and propeller, which is bad for packing fuel for delta-v. Therefore, we had to increase the amount of torque per blade, and since we are already at 2 blades per propeller, we have to add another motor to each propeller. We did this by connecting a second motor, rotor head to rotor head, to the first rotor, and then using some struts to connect the stator of the second motor back to the fairing. While using docking ports for this connection would obviously be lighter, it just didn't seem to work. We have doubled the torque available per blade, but we are still just a bit shy of the amount of torque needed to drive the blades at the deploy angle where they produce the highest lift. Here, we choose to change our deploy angle to reduce the amount of torque needed. At high speeds, drag contributes to almost no torque, so it's only the amount of lift that matters. Limited by the lift, there would be two angles on either side of the peak that would result in local maximums of thrust. But which one do we choose? Turns out, the drag of fully occluded heat shields is dominated by the tip drag generated by the drag cube face corresponding to the top rim. As a result, the drag almost scales with the cosine of the angle of attack, which decreases as the angle of attack increases. Therefore, to maximize the thrust, we choose the maximum with the higher angle of attack. For heat shields, this higher angle of attack translates to the ablator side pointing more prograde. Therefore, once the craft starts to pick up some speed, we switch to this deploy angle to maximize net thrust. While this sounds minute, it did significantly increase acceleration at higher speeds, and, most importantly, it allowed the props to go about 2000 meters per second faster than when choosing the other deploy angle, which was essential for this mission. And lastly, the fairing was expanded significantly to increase its occlusion power, which made it occlude the flat adapters on the props more reliably, and since this fairing is the root part of the craft, this change did not cause any additional drag. Now, there is still a very long way in the propeller phase of the ascent, so we will just let you enjoy the rest. After building up speed for 80 hours at a snail's pace with these props, we have reached a speed of 10.5 km per second, making this by far the fastest propeller craft in KSP. We are now getting very little acceleration out of the props, so we will shut them down and use the 10 ion engines to continue our way to orbit. The ion phase is going to be significantly shorter, though it still took 9 hours. Now, we just need to coast up to apoapsis, where we perform a circularization burn, almost exhausting all of the ion fuel and leaving only 26 meters per second of delta V remaining. In testing, we did have plenty of margins, however, RSS VE not only removed the surface, but also shrunk Jupiter considerably without changing its mass, which means that we needed more speed to reach orbit while fighting a higher gravity. But luckily, we have indeed reached orbit and Bill is finally safe. And here we have it, an almost stock SSTO capable of ascending from RSS Jupiter's sea level to orbit. If this craft was instead used for other missions, it can, with some modifications, easily do a single stage round trip to Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune in one mission. Now, we just have to dock the transfer stage complex and the SSTO together. It's time to plan our journey back and pick up all the stages we left on the way. The first stages we're gonna pick up are those left in highly elliptical Jupiter orbit. and to get there, we need another lengthy chain of gravity assists. But before that, we need to transfer to Io first, which will take about 14 km per second of delta V. As close as the moons are to Jupiter, in terms of delta V they are still very far away from a low orbit. Of course, this means we need a lot of periapsis kicks, in fact about 80 of them. Luckily, we have a simple KOS script that will execute them, it's just gonna take a while. After finishing the last ejection, we obtain a rendezvous with Io, after which we repeatedly get gravity assists off of it. There were 20 Io assists just for this phase. After these assists, we continue with some more Ganymede assists. At this point, we still have a lot of inclination relative to the moons, so the first few assists are used to cancel out the inclination relative to Ganymede. After these assists, our argument of periapsis ended up quite far away from where we wanted it to be, so we use a chain of double Ganymede swing-bys. We alternate between raising and lowering our orbit with the same body, which, when applied repeatedly, produces these nice flower petal shapes. The last one of them sends the craft to a carefully chosen intercept with Ganymede, after which a few assists swing us back to Io. Just like previously, all that's left to do now is to use repeated Io flybys to raise our orbit. After the last Io flyby, we lower our periapsis and match inclination with the target, after which we set up a rendezvous with it. To put the stages back together, we first separate the small moon lander and small transfer stage from the rest of the craft, which then docks to the front port of the two stages left in high orbit. This whole assembly is then united with the rest of the craft. After everything was put back into place, we fold the craft in again to get it ready for the capture at Earth. After all these years in the Jovian system, we can finally transfer home. This ejection will send us onto a 1-to-1 resonant orbit with Jupiter to get an assist. After this flyby, we head straight to Earth. Capture at Earth is roughly similar to our capture at Jupiter, however, it is much longer, and most of the time was spent flying upside down to keep ourselves inside the atmosphere. Just as before, we need to watch for overheating in the ducted fan at the back. Besides that, we also start to cancel some of the inclination. After this pass, one additional aerobraking pass was performed to get into an equatorial low Earth orbit. With a brief circularization burn, we can prepare to dock to the remaining stage. The first step is to unfold the craft and, most importantly, to unfold the docking port that the stage originally docked to. Now, it is time to rendezvous with the last piece of hardware and dock with it. Once everything is docked, we can fold up the craft for the last time such that it is ready for re-entry. After deorbiting, we can re-enter and target the KSC. During re-entry, we deploy the cargo bay to control our drag, and roll both to control vertical speed and to steer the vehicle towards the Space Center. As the craft heads towards the KSC, it is now time to summarize the mission. We have landed on all 4 moons of Jupiter, and we have also dived down to Jupiter's sea level using an SSTO. To get there and back, we used a total of about 130 gravity assists and spent a combined 120 hours just doing atmospheric ascent. The craft we used contains 7 modules, which were all picked up. From the start of the Jupiter SSTO design to the end of the recording, this mission took well over a year of real time and 113 years of in-game time. In many aspects, this was a really long journey. As we approach the KSC, we use roll to do some final corrections, then we spin up the ducted fans which start to generate a lot of drag and slow us down quickly. After reaching a height of 2000 meters, we flip the craft such that it is pointed nose up. Now, we just have to slowly descend to our landing spot. Bill chose to land on top of a control tower in an attempt to scare the air traffic control crew. Whoops, looks like the space is narrower than we expected. Let's try that again. And, with a tightly fitted landing, our mission comes to an end. We have completed a trip to all the Jovian moons and Jupiter itself in a fully reusable craft. And indeed, if we check the part count, no part was accidentally left behind or destroyed. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you next time.